Good evening, and welcome to the first Baumer lecture of this semester. My name is Thijs van Massakers, and I'm an associate professor of city and regional planning here at the Knowlton School. Tonight, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Professor Todd Bendor, coming to us from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he currently serves as the chair of the Department of City and Regional Planning. Those of you who have attended Baumer lectures before probably know that when faculty get asked to introduce our speakers, they frequently procrastinate and wait until the very last evening before the lecture to actually write these opening remarks. While we like to tell you, the students, to prepare your homework carefully and well in advance of the deadline, we ourselves fall into some of the same traps of waiting until the last minute. In this case, last night around 9 p.m., I sat down with a notepad and a pen and turned on the television for some background noise. As I was flipping channels, I was made aware of some disturbing news related to dogs in Ohio. And I happen to know that Professor Bendor is and has long been a proud and loving dog owner. So first, before I go on, I want to start by thanking Professor Bendor for his courage for getting into an airplane to Ohio, of all places, this very morning. I'm guessing you left your dog in North Carolina. If not, we'll do our best to protect him. So about 90 minutes later, television still on, I learned that Taylor Swift has issued an endorsement related to the American presidential campaign, which led me to think about the similarities and differences between Professor Bendor and Taylor Swift. Pet owners both, leaders in their respective fields, and people I happened to be thinking about last night. For context, it's important to point out that I do not consider myself a Swiftie, so the analogy might be off in places, but I think it'll help all of you understand Professor Bendor's professional life, or at least how I see it, if I compare the two. I met Professor Bendor in the spring of 2012 at MIT when he was on a pre-tenure sabbatical. He had spent the first part of that year-long sabbatical in Paris at the Sorbonne University, and that same year, he was also the Frederick J. Clark Fellow at the United States Army Corps of Engineers Institute for Water Resources in Alexandria, Virginia. So this combination of activities, right, visiting professor at the Sorbonne, visiting professor at MIT, and fellow at one of the foremost think tanks within the federal bureaucracy, during a single pre-tenure sabbatical, tells you something important about Professor Bendor. His energy cannot be contained, which brings me back to Taylor Swift. On her 2022 album Midnights, Taylor Swift released the bonus track Paris, in which she sings, "We drew a map on the bedroom ceiling. No, I didn't see the news because we were somewhere else in an alleyway drinking champagne because we were in Paris." So much like Taylor Swift, Todd Bendor might be found drawing maps and drinking champagne in an alleyway at the same time, but rather than write a song about it, he's more likely to publish the results in a top-level journal on agent-based modeling. Which brings me back to his work. Before arriving at UNC Chapel Hill, where he's now been a professor for 17 years, Todd earned his PhD in planning at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, his master's in environmental science from Washington State University, and his bachelor's in systems dynamics from Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Worcester, Mass. For those of you familiar with the region, WPI is in the NUMAC conference, like MIT, Wellesley, and Brandeis. The NUMAC conference is kind of like the Big Ten, except it's completely different. WPI's version of Carmen, Ohio is a song called E to the X, which I'm assuming Todd sang passionately. So at WPI, Todd wrote not one, but two undergraduate theses, and the topics related to automobile fuels and risks associated with GMOs, or genetically modified organisms. So again, much like Taylor Swift, Professor Bendor's scholarship has been diverse in terms of the specific problems, methods, or research questions, but remarkably consistent in terms of the overall themes. His more than 60 peer-reviewed articles consistently answer questions and advance our understanding of how communities can, or sometimes should, frequently through modeling, make sense of their environments in ways that enable thoughtful planning and decision-making. In a non-trivial way, models play a role in Professor Bendor's work, not unlike that of boyfriends in Taylor Swift's. Professor Bendor's work is almost always on some form of modeling, sometimes explicitly so, in his 2019 book on collaborative modeling, or his 2018 article on participatory modeling. The latter was cited more than 450 times, by the way. At other times, his work explores models we use to make sense of our world more implicitly, like his work on ecosystem services and the paradigms it enables related to plan making, or his more recent work on the linguistic models planners invoke to describe different levels of density. Given Professor Bendor's energy and thematic consistency, it should come as no surprise that he has become one of the leading voices in our field on issues related to environmental modeling and planning and decision-making. His work has been cited more than 4,000 times, and several of his contributions, including, but not only the two I just mentioned, have become standard citations in their respective subfields. In other words, it's necessary to think of Professor Bendor's entire scholarly oeuvre at this point like a remarkable and influential catalog with several greatest hits, not unlike Taylor Swift's. Finally, I'll say something on Professor Bendor's influence on my own work, which has been profound and long-lasting. When I decided to study markets for ecosystem services for my dissertation, this was regarded by many as a niche choice in the field of planning. As these institutions were and have remained somewhat isolated from the more conventional approaches to land use planning and management, yet Todd, through his own work and his direct encouragement of mine, has always helped me understand and argue for the relationship between seemingly obscure institutional innovations and the broader field of planning. So while I would never consider myself Ed Sheeran to Todd Bendor's Taylor Swift, it's probably no surprise that those two also met in the spring of 2012, which is true, by the way. Taylor Swift and Ed Sheeran met in the spring of 2012. So perhaps the more accurate way of stating this is that much like Taylor Swift, Todd has been a friend and champion of junior academics and their careers since I have known him, for which I'm personally grateful. Please join me in welcoming Todd Bendor.
Oh my God, thank you. That's the best introduction I've ever gotten. Close second was when somebody said I was the Newt Gingrich of the environmental restoration industry. I don't know how I feel about that, but well, thank you so much for having me today. It's an honor to be here and to talk to you about some of the work that I've been working on with colleagues for around a decade now. I want to talk about ecological restoration and kind of an overview, talk about what is ecological restoration, talk about this in kind of a weird way, at least the way that most people talk about restoration, thinking about the drivers of restoration, what makes restoration actually happen. Talking about some of the markets that Tice alluded to in terms of drivers of restoration, actually encouraging restoration or requiring restoration to happen. Also talk about really the economic impacts of restoration. And that's kind of what this ultimately is about, is kind of a language for putting this practice, I think, on a level playing field with many others that we hear about all the time. And then finally, like some takeaways. So lots of students here, if you want to go into this field, I like to think about this space as a way for ecologists to become millionaires. I know ecologists that have become millionaires. And I think that's kind of cool, given the fact that, you think about, how do I make a ton of money? Well, be a lawyer or a doctor or go into finance. Well, this is also a way to make a lot of money. And there are people that have made millions and millions of dollars doing this. So land degradation is a huge problem around the world. The current pledges under something called the Bond Challenge, as well as a whole variety of, there's 3 different Rio conventions in which almost 200 countries have pledged land to be restored. The area of this land that is considered degraded around the world is somewhere between the area of Australia and the area of the US. This is between 5.8 and 7.5% of all of the land mass on Earth is considered degraded. And you might think, well, wow, this happened a long time ago. Actually, most of this happened in the last 50 years. So this is actually very recent. In the United States, there's, I think, one of the more interesting statistics, kind of environmental statistics, is actually around wetland degradation in the US and wetland conversion. Starting in the early 80s, the US Fish and Wildlife Service started counting, essentially, wetlands and trying to measure how many wetlands are still around. And what they were able to estimate was that between 1780 and 1980, something like 60 acres of wetlands were destroyed every hour 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 200 years in the contiguous United States. So there's been a huge amount of land degradation, and ultimately a lot of this, this image is from the Society for Ecological Restoration, which does a lot of work globally, but nowadays is due to large-scale, low-density development in the United States. So a lot of this kind of land conversion and ultimately creating degradation downstream or on site. So what is ecological restoration? Well, the Society for Ecological Restoration has defined it kind of relatively recently. The process of assisting the recovery and management of ecological integrity. And this is kind of a vague definition. And ultimately this definition tries to get at this idea of biodiversity, enhancing biodiversity on a site, ensuring that ecological processes are occurring, ecological structures that allow those processes to occur. There's something to be said about the regional and like historical context of a site, right? And sustainable cultural practices, because ultimately a really key factor here is what happens when an ecosystem becomes impossible to sustain. So even this word restoration implies going back to something versus adapting an ecosystem to be able to survive and essentially be able to thrive into the future. So this is a continuum of what ecological restoration actually means. Everything from, hey, stop destroying the ecosystem, stop destroying the site, all the way to improving management behavior, for example, sustainable agricultural practices versus unsustainable ones. Starting with things like remediation, removing toxic chemicals, for example, that might have been on a site. And then actually starting to recover that site into some sort of, again, a site that would have ecological integrity, that would be able to sustain itself. And at the other end, we basically see full-on restoration, native ecosystems, native plant animal communities. And this can become very, very, very expensive, very time-consuming. In fact, ecological restoration is called the acid test or the litmus test of our knowledge of ecology, right? Our ability to recreate an ecosystem tells us how much we know about that ecosystem to start with. So there's lots of kind of benefits, right, of gaining ecological integrity. And Society for Ecological Restoration, I think, has done a good job here, right? Doing things like erosion control, restoring soil, replanting, and creating these kind of intact ecosystems that can survive and can survive change around them. And so what we can think about are kind of different cases for ecological restoration. The first being just the ecological case. And so a lot of people will say, well, you disturb an ecosystem, right? You cut down a forest. Great thing about forests, they grow back, right? It'll heal itself. It'll essentially restore itself. Well, ultimately, the goal of restoration in many cases is to speed up this natural process. What if it becomes very dangerous, like literally hazardous, to wait for an ecosystem, long periods, potentially decades, hundreds of years, maybe even thousands of years, for these natural processes to actually work, right? So what happens if we need it to occur faster? In other cases, it won't occur at all, right? There's kind of the passive, like, let nature take its course response. It won't actually happen, right? There's lots of situations. We see this in stormwater situations all the time. Increased runoff erodes soils. Those soils no longer vegetated. Now water moves even faster across them. It creates this vicious cycle of erosion leading to more erosion, leading to more erosion. And so we see this in lots of areas, former mine sites, right? Areas where there's overgrazing and kind of continued overgrazing. So something has to be done at these sites. Some sort of like active restoration actually has to occur. People have to do something to maintain these sites, right? And so this ultimately is this kind of prevention of a runaway behavior. There's also a social case to make for restoration. It can bring communities closer to the land. It can create educational opportunities, create opportunities for social environmental justice. Great example of this is the Manzanar Mangrove Initiative, where this is in Eritrea, where this was explicitly created, create whole new forests of mangrove trees. Poverty would be alleviated by creating a renewable resource mangrove trees. And so specifically aimed at poverty alleviation, right? And so finally we can come to the economic case for restoration. And in this case, I think it gets a bit more complicated. So we come back to like, hey, it's great to build ecological integrity. Well, the other piece of this is that there's actually people doing stuff in this. And it turns out that when people do stuff, they often get paid. And when they get paid, they do stuff with that money. That's actually the whole story here. It's a succinct summary of this whole talk. So there's kind of two different cases for restoration here. One is the economic benefits, and this is what kind of environmentalists, environmental scholars in one shape or another have been writing about for decades. This notion that, well, healthy ecosystems save us money, they create ecosystem services, right? These beneficial functions that ecosystems produce. Hey, there's a medicine that is produced in this wetland. That is something that I value in one way or another. And so that's a value created by that wetland. So we can think about this in all different kinds of ways, but we can also distill this in a little bit of a different way. We can think about this, the second case, in terms of the economic impacts. And the economic impacts here are fundamentally about jobs that are created and maintained. Economic output, this is basically the revenue of restorers. So if I pay those people you saw in the other image, right? Hey, go out and do all these different restoration-related tasks. So they now have jobs, right? I pay them to do that. Well, ultimately, they've got to go and get stuff. They've got a supply chain. So this is the indirect economic impacts as a result of this. And it turns out that everything that they buy and everyone in that whole supply chain, when they get paid, they spend that money back into the economy, right? They go out to eat and they go to grocery stores and they go out for movies and they actually like spend that money. And that is an induced kind of ripple effect across the economy. And so we can sum this all together and think about actual like gross regional product. Regional economists talk about gross regional product. You probably heard of gross domestic product, right? This is all, all of the income basically summed together. And so if we start to think about this from the act of paying people to do restoration, well, this can actually add up pretty quickly. And so ultimately, it's important to note here that economic benefits of doing restoration, right? Hey, we did this big restoration project, now we've got cleaner water, there's better habitat, right? Those are benefits, but those aren't necessarily impacts. So we're kind of using a different language here to talk about this. So why do I want a different language? Well, it turns out that we need a different language. I would argue we need a different language. So during the, I'm trying to remember even what election this was. You heard about the Keystone XL pipeline. Who here has heard of the Keystone XL pipeline? Like a lot of you. And it's like, what the heck is the Keystone XL pipeline? I don't know, but it was gonna create a ton of jobs. My favorite part of this was it was gonna create a ton of jobs, and a lot of jobs were gonna be really long-term because they were gonna be maintenance jobs. And it was like, so this is gonna leak a lot. No, it's not going to leak at all. So there's not going to be a lot of maintenance jobs. It's like you're going to have all these people employed doing what exactly if this thing is perfectly built? And it turns out that after Cornell Institute of Labor Relations redid the analysis on this, is way, way, way fewer jobs than was originally discussed. But it's a great example of an incredibly forceful argument. Hey, I want to do this thing, and it's probably pretty bad for the environment, but it turns out it's going to create a ton of jobs. And that's going to be really valuable, especially in areas that don't have a lot of employment. So that's the first thing, is the language. The second thing is that we see this narrative kind of all over the place. It's overwhelming, right? Environmental protection law, environmental law kills jobs, right? We hear this kind of all the time. And we can't afford to do restoration. We can't afford to do less environmentally damaging activities because doing that will kill jobs. And really what this is assuming is this notion that restoration or the impacts of those policies are dead weight loss on the economy. This is an economist term that basically means really nobody is benefiting from this, right? The people damaging the environment aren't benefiting, and the public isn't benefiting. It's just kind of taking money and flushing it down the toilet, right? That's essentially what's being said. And this ignores a lot of things. It's important to kind of, when you hear this argument, to say, okay, well, what's the flip side of this? Because it turns out stop signs kill jobs. The building code kills jobs, right? Because you've got to do things to meet a building code. And things that, well, if you built it a lot cheaper, a lot less safe, we could use cheaper materials, cheaper labor, and we could maybe build more buildings. I mean, that's the style of argument, right? And so this ignores, in the building code example, talking to lots of architects here, it ignores, right, a lot of the, what are the benefits of having a building code, right? All of the safety, so on and so forth. That's really important. And so ultimately, one of the things I'll talk about is the notion that, understanding what the restoration industry, I'll call it, looks like could be really important. Just like understanding, hey, we're gonna require that a licensed electrician wire up this building. Now we've got electricians as a field. That's a thing you can do, that's a profession, right? And it created a huge number of jobs doing that. So ultimately what we wanted to do was consider kind of the redistributive employment effects of these restoration requirements, right? You're basically saying you want to build a shopping mall on top of a giant wetland. Cool. What happens if we make you restore the area that you damaged? And so by not having to restore it, well, it becomes cheaper. Right? You create jobs, but by having to restore it, you also have to create jobs. So that investment goes somewhere, and that's ultimately the question. And our hypothesis in going into all this was this probably isn't a dead weight loss. Yeah. So we're not the first ones to look at this, and this has actually been very awkward in this work because it's kind of caught on and become very popular. The University of Oregon has an ecosystem workforce group that is absolutely amazing organization. And they have been writing about this for, I don't even know how long, several decades. But it's been really highly localized to the state of Oregon, where you basically had a huge workforce. A lot of those jobs were being offshored to other countries. And so they were looking at this and saying, well, we've got all of these workers that used to be in forestry, what could they be doing? And it turns out that there's a real nice fit there for doing ecological restoration. So they started funding a lot of restoration projects to the point where people are even able to track to the county how much money was spent in the economic impacts of that. So there's also more recent work that's been done by groups like World Resources Institute, the Nature Conservancy. I have a colleague at the Environmental Policy Innovation Center. They actually have a restoration economy program, and UN, so on. There's a lot of people looking at this same idea. So we're kind of joining this much larger kind of community of folks working in this space. And only recently I've started working internationally on this because there's, I think, a real appetite, and I'll talk about that more, but to look at this in an international context. Okay, so for a really long time, for like a good chunk of my adult life, I feel like we've been talking about the green economy, right? Usually this is like shorthand for renewable energy. Wind turbines, solar, that kind of thing. And so people have been looking at this for a very long time and its actual employment effects. And we see this even today, right? We're expected to add 300 million kind of green collar jobs around the world by 2050. This is probably a huge underestimate of that. This green economy is increasingly being recognized as a source of innovation and a source of kind of a base industry driving a lot of other economic activity. But the thing is, the reason I would argue why you've heard a lot about renewable energy and maybe nothing about ecological restoration is that restoration is actually really, really difficult to study in this context because it's actually assembled out of a lot of different other types of businesses, right? There's not, solar company does solar, I guess unless you're Tesla, and then it's a side gig. But restoration companies, for many of them, for a very long time, it's been a side gig. And because of that, it's been really difficult to tease out what is the actual like amount that people are spending on restoration. So many different industries. And so the reason I say that is if you hear this all the time, like what's the size of a given industry, right? My favorite is like the video game industry. This is an enormous industry and it's really easy to track because ultimately we've created systems that allow us, I mean, you can literally just go on the Bureau of Labor Statistics website and be like, how many people are employed by the video game industry, right? And it's easy because we have a system for this. This is called the North American Industry Classification System, or NAIC system. And so this is like every business has a code. And so because every business has a code and they're tracked based on this code, it's like your student ID number. They can track like what have you done, what have you taken, and they actually do surveys of those businesses based on their code. And so towards the end, I'm foreshadowing, right? We don't have any of these codes for a lot of these firms doing restoration. We have these codes for every other kind of green industry, green business, right? We just can't track it with restoration. So how have we studied this? So I said I've been looking at this for a while. We started this with a study in 2014. And what we tried to do was look at this from the perspective kind of top down, like follow the money, right? Track where are we spending money on restoration? And so what we wanted to do is develop a definition of restoration. I kind of haven't given you really a good definition of restoration. So we had to develop one here. We wanted to review kind of everything that we could find on this topic. And then what we kind of hoped to do at that point was develop like a database of like all of the spending programs on restoration. And we were so excited to do this. And that, number 3, was a disaster. That did not work out well. Then what we decided to do was kind of flip this around and look at this bottom up. So what we did was we actually went to the firms that we thought did restoration. And we asked them, hey, do you do restoration? Cool. How much do you make? Right? So basically looking at firms and what kind of money they made. Right? So kind of, in theory, kind of looking at it from the opposite direction. It's like building a bridge from one side of the river, building a bridge from the other side. And unfortunately, they completely didn't line up. But that's okay. And then what we did was we used modeling, input-output modeling, which I'll talk about, to basically try to understand the actual economic impacts of all this money, of all this spending. So this was a while ago. More recently, what we did was we did a follow-up and we zoomed in and we said, let's look at one specific industry within this. This is an industry Tice alluded to called mitigation industry. And we wanted to understand, well, what's the actual kind of size of this industry? This is an industry that's created by a US law. It exists entirely because of this US law. And so how has this changed over time? And then what's happening right now is a follow-up that's trying to look at everything restoration related and even zoom into specific states to try to understand how are certain states kind of performing relative to others, right? Are states like, is there like a Silicon Valley of the restoration industry, right? Is there, like biotech in Massachusetts or the, tech in California? Is there a place that's becoming like that in a given state in the United States? Okay, so what the heck is ecological restoration? This is like a navel-gazing thing that ecologists have done for like 50 years, like just thinking about pondering the theory behind this. The thing is that at the end of the day, it's kind of like you do restoration or not based on the study that you do. This type of analysis is kind of, it's hair splitting. It's putting things in boxes. And so what we said was that any combination of activities that are intended to result in ecological uplift. This is a really interesting problem because if you leave here and you go and you work for, say, an environmental engineer that does bioremediation. So we took a toxic waste site and we turned it into a parking lot. Is that ecological restoration? Yeah, but it's not really like leading to a functional ecosystem. So we kind of arbitrarily drew a line. And we drew a line that made this, like all of our estimates, really conservative. So all the numbers I'm going to show you are like really very, very conservative as a result of that. So the restoration industry then is like the set of economic activities that contribute to restoration. So project planning, the engineering. Literally, there are people whose title is stream designer, which I think is kind of cool. Suppliers of inputs, people, native plant nurseries, earth moving equipment. One of the most famous ecological restoration firms used to be an earth mover in Chicago, actually. So we looked at all of the literature we could find, and one of the really interesting indicators of, and this kind of metric used in economic development work is something called an employment multiplier. And so this has to do with, for every job you create, what kind of ripple effect do you have through the economy? And so oil and gas industry, it's about 3. Livestock, right, a little over 3. And for restoration, what we had found was for every job that you create, there's around like 1.5 to 3.8 jobs are created. So this means that on the high end there, you're basically creating a huge number of jobs when you invest in this. So if I pay those people in that image earlier to do a restoration project, that's actually reverberating in terms of employment throughout the economy. There's also an output multiplier, which is for every dollar that you invest, how much does that reverberate through the economy? And there's also just the sheer number of jobs, right? So Keystone XL pipeline, gonna create a bajillion jobs, right? Well, we don't know if they're good jobs, but we can talk about like there's lots and lots of jobs. And so we found all of these different numbers, realistically up to like 30 jobs, 33 jobs per $1 million invested. which is pretty good. So if you're a politician and you're just like, I want jobs, and you're completely laser focused on that, this suggests that this could be an avenue, okay? All right, so ultimately though, we were really interested in like what actually drives demand for restoration? Like why are people buying? If restoration is like a good, something you could buy and sell, then what actually drives demand for it? And related to this is kind of, well, who pays for restoration? And why do they pay? And so people who have looked at this have considered kind of who's the customer. Is it governments? Is it like civil society or like non-governmental organizations like the Nature Conservancy? Or are they like private people who just want restoration done? Or companies that want to enhance their standing with the public, right? To pay for a bunch of restoration. So we looked at this, and what we found were kind of 5 major drivers, and these are dramatically different in the US versus elsewhere, okay? So the first, and in the US, far away, the biggest driver is regulations. So regulations that require or incentivize restoration. And so these could be, globally, mine reclamation requirements. At the very beginning, and I'll get at the end, there's a PDF of all of these, and there's actually a link to this atlas of mine regulations in Africa. And you can actually start to, like, that they've started tracking the different mine reclamation requirements. Mine reclamation equals a form of restoration, right? So you went in, you dug out all the, whatever you were mining, you've got to do something with that land at the end. South Africa's really coming down on invasive species. And so forcing people that have introduced non-native species to fix it. So in the US, the biggest here is the Clean Water Act. This is Section 404, and this is a program that requires restoration, wetlands or streams to offset damage from like building a mall, or a lot of the time it's actually state departments of transportation building roads, which does a huge amount of environmental damage. So primary driver, we did this survey, talk about in a minute. What's the primary driver of your firm's restoration work? And it turns out like the majority of it are regulations that are driving the bulk of this work. And so this is either CERCLA, which is for hazardous waste sites, or natural resource damage assessments, Endangered Species Act. A lot of times, I want to put in a natural gas pipeline, or I want to put in a electrical high tension wires. Well, that's crossing endangered species habitat. You've got to mitigate that damage. And then the Clean Water Act, right? And there are actually markets for these two, right? So this is kind of an idea I'll introduce, but ultimately thinking about these regulations driving markets for restoration. This is now not a new idea anymore. So Ron Coase, who won the Nobel Prize in economics for some very different work, and John Dales, who's at the University of Toronto, offered this idea in the 60s that basically said, hey, we can use market forces to protect the environment. So allow polluters to negotiate amongst each other, and they can figure out a strategy to reduce pollution that's lower cost than the government imposing these ideas. This is the notion, right? So the most popular version of this is something called cap and trade. Probably heard of cap and trade, right? So establish some sort of limit to pollution, give people right to pollute, and then like let them kind of figure it out amongst themselves in trading. And so we've seen this for the European Union's emissions trading scheme for carbon. Much older one was actually the US. When I was growing up, we had acid rain. We never hear about this anymore. This is the sulfur dioxide market that was actually created. It's incredibly successful at reducing the effects of sulfurated coal. So we don't have acid rain anymore, at least it's not as acid. We also have these regulated offset markets. And this is really where we are today, right? So if you want to build a mall, a house, a road through an aquatic ecosystem, you have to get a permit to do that. And that permit is only given to you if you basically pay somebody to do restoration to offset the damage, right? So who do you pay? Well, it turns out there might be like a dozen different companies that will do that restoration for you. And they're competing with each other, voila, market, right? And so the idea here is that this is restoration that's not funded by the government, which is, as we'll see, like relatively unique. This is making private entities pay other private entities for doing restoration. It's not on the taxpayer, basically. Okay, second one, public procurement, right? So this is the classic notion of the government paying individuals, companies, or landowners to do better stuff on their land. And so the classic example of this is something called a Payment for Ecosystem Services program, the most common of which are actually in the United States. If you ever hear somebody say, we pay farmers not to farm, people heard that before? We pay farmers not to farm in the United States. Yes, we do. We pay farmers. This is something called the Wetland Reserve Program and the Conservation Reserve Program. These are areas that farmers have that are usually really marginal for growing crops. And so we pay them not to farm in those areas and to, in fact, leave them as natural areas. And this has actually been enormously beneficial. And this is where I'm paying a farmer for the ecosystem services or to produce better ecosystem services. So Jim Saltzman, who's now at UCLA, did an analysis of this a few years ago and found like hundreds of these across the world. Governments paying landowners to just like take better care of their properties. And in many cases, this was enabling farmers to use more sustainable kind of practices. Regional government initiatives. Easiest in the US would be the Everglades, for example. We funnel tons of money into restoring the Everglades. The Iraqi marshlands is kind of a global version of this. Wetlands that were the size of Florida itself that were drained in the 90s by actually Saddam Hussein. And so these are slowly being restored with money coming from a huge number of sources, kind of through government channels. Internal government agency policies, right? So these are basically policies that require governments who, throughout history, usually think about governments as often being the ones requiring better practices. But actually, phase 2 of the Clean Water Act, for example, one of the main ideas was like the local governments usually are the worst polluters. So this idea that you'd require governments to have better practices. And so we see this all the time. For example, like best practices for utilities. Or for any activity, the Army Corps of Engineers wants to build some sort of large infrastructure project. Oh, they're going to do a ton of environmental damage doing that. They got to fix it, right? So that requirement alone. And then the last one is just voluntary investment, like just because you're a great person, you just wanted to do this restoration. And globally, this is probably one of the most extensive drivers of restoration. If you actually look at like why so many of these restoration projects are happening, it's private foundations, it's governments channeling money in the form of like international aid. That's funding a lot of restoration. So tons of this. So how do you actually figure out this restoration economy, right? Like you're pouring all this money into it. Well, the first thing you got to do, right, is define restoration based on the types of industries that you care about. And so we did that, right? Talked about that a minute ago. The second thing you've got to do is define like all of the restoration firms, or try to understand who's doing restoration. This is actually extremely difficult. In a lot of countries, there aren't companies doing this. You're literally paying individual landowners. And so one of the ways that we can think about like the idea of a restoration industry is landowners that become so good at it or so knowledgeable about restoration that they actually start to sell their services, right? Or start to help their neighbors do restoration, in which case like they're now a little restoration business. But how do we find out where all the restoration businesses are? This is actually a really big problem. And in our work, probably one of the reasons like we really underestimated all of this. We then got to survey those firms. So we got to ask them questions. Do you do restoration? We think you do restoration. A lot of them said no. How much of your sales are from restoration, would you say? I don't know what is going on here. There we go. Then what we do is we say, all right, we got a few people responded to our survey. Hopefully lots of people respond to our survey. This is one thing we could vastly improve, especially if we're doing this in an international context, really reaching out to these firms. And we basically say, okay, this is the universe. This is all the people doing restoration. You are all restoration businesses. And I'm going to estimate that this is how much total revenue you get from restoration, right? And then the last thing we got to do is actually model, like, what kind of businesses are you and how do you spend money? So you get $1 million, you don't just get to like walk away with $1 million. You've got to buy stuff. You've got an entire supply chain. So you've got to pay your workers, right? And so this ultimately is what we do with input-output modeling. And so input-output modeling is able to look at this question about how does spending money actually affect the economy? How does it ripple through the economy? And we talk about this as direct impacts. So how much money do you make? How did this money affect your supply chain? This indirect impacts. Induced effects. So how did this ripple through the economy? Right? And I mentioned like all these workers buy gas, they stay in hotels, they do stuff with their families. They go to Disney World, right? They spend money. And so we asked respondents basically to give us this information as well as their industry classification. And we used input-output modeling to basically model how, half of you are in one industry, a quarter of you are in another industry. And what input-output modeling does is basically say, okay, on average, this industry buys in a certain pattern. This is how it buys office supplies. This is how it buys, rocks, whatever it's buying, native plants, and so on. And so from this, we can start to get things like output, like how much actual output is generated because of an individual worker that's employed. So if I spend $1 million in this industry, how many jobs does that create? And then how much total output does that make? Okay, so, man, like everything I've ever written in my life as like a scholar, and then I wrote this, and suddenly like I see this on random websites that are like estimates of the size of the restoration industry. Coming up with a big round number is like a really handy thing. So, especially a number that's like really close to $25 billion. So we estimated an economic impact, a total economic impact of $25 billion. So basically what we estimated is that this entire industry employed about 126,000 people. To give you a sense of what that means, that's almost twice the size of the coal industry. This is always interesting because we're even hearing about coal in this election. Coal, West Virginia coal. Coal in West Virginia, I think, has been 3% of their economy for the last like 25 years. It's a tiny percent of like even West Virginia's economy. Coal is not a actually very large industry in terms of employment. This has a lot of employment here. And so there's another 26,000 people that all of this spending on restoration, basically through the supply chain, because we're spending money on restoration, that supports another 26,000 jobs. And then all of those people collectively spending money in the economy support another 68,000. So you kind of can add these vertically. So when we talk about the video game industry, how big is the video game industry? How big is the restoration industry? It's about a $9.5 billion industry. That's what that means, $9.5 billion industry. Compared to video games, this is tiny. But if you talk to people that are in this industry, that view this as like a cottage industry, like they view themselves as like, I do this really niche, abstract thing, then all of a sudden it's like, you kind of don't. You're part of a much bigger space here. So we asked him about, what do you actually do restoration related? Real estate, site acquisition, the financing, legal stuff, permitting around this, monitoring, long-term monitoring, going out to sites and making sure that they're not like destroyed, big aspect of this. What types of restoration do you do? Pretty much every ecosystem is represented here, right? And this actually probably belies the bias in the people we contacted. We probably could have contacted a lot more people, and it would have changed some of these numbers. So since then, right, there's been really interesting stuff that's started to happen, right? So all of a sudden, all these little firms, again, these are, hey, yeah, I'll restore that, you know, wetland or that prairie. They actually created an industry association. They have a lobbyist. And they have a lobbyist that was actually very successful in getting their revenue taxed as capital gains and not income. This is one of these like pro move by the lobbyist. So unlike many other businesses where you make money, it's taxed as income. Theirs is taxed as at a way lower rate. Pretty effective, I think. We also see more recently a diversification of business models. This is partly because of some of the politics at play here. There's a Supreme Court case actually last year that really changed the landscape in terms of what requires restoration. You can now damage a lot of streams that you couldn't 2 or 3 years ago, and you don't have to restore them. And then finally, a lot of concentration within the industry. So a lot of these bigger firms buying little firms, like mom and pop shops. But what was really interesting is there's still a lot of these mom and pop shops. Like if you were interested in this, you could create a restoration firm. I had a friend who finished graduate school, went to work for a restoration firm for a couple of years, and then started his own very successful firm. And you know, it recently got bought, right? So hey, it sounds like tech industry, you know? He dresses very well. So what we did was this kind of phase 3 I mentioned before, was we tried to zoom in to this, this wetland and stream industry. And this kind of looks like it did before, but we've got results from 2014, way back when, and results from 2019. And the cool thing about the timing on this is that's 5 years, and so we could start to calculate things that are calculated for a lot of other industries. One of them is called the compound annual growth rate. This is a measure that economists use to basically say, all right, how quickly is an industry growing? And like, if you look it up, the fastest growing industries are tech, right? Tech. Turns out though, this is actually a pretty good growth rate. This actually puts this industry in the top third of all industries in terms of its growth rate. And this is despite a ton of things that have been going against it. 15% increase in employment, 35% increase in total output. This is interesting because it implies that these businesses are getting more efficient. And we actually see this throughout a lot of the economy. You can create more output with like less people, basically. And these are really good jobs in this particular industry. So this is the average labor income per job. And in some cases, this will include blue collar and white collar workers. This is probably more biased towards white collar, but not bad. So just a sense of, mitigation compared to other industries, just in terms of employment. It's beaten the sound recording industry. I guess that's a good metric. In terms of growth, kind of right in the middle of things. But ultimately, what this let us do is actually estimate, kind of got error bars here, is estimate in a really tight way how this industry was growing over time. And it really hasn't been going all over the place. It's been kind of this steady growth. All right, some takeaways. Restoration can create a lot of jobs. I think this is really, it's not shocking to me, but it's shocking to people who do restoration. When you say, how many people do you employ? They don't even think about themselves as employers. It really is like, it's an identity thing. And ultimately, as I said before, it's a language thing. It's being able to say, like, you're an employer, you're a jobs creator, right? That's a powerful thing. We should probably maintain and enhance drivers of restoration. And so we can think about like ways to actually drive the restoration industry forward, which, I mean, you take a step back and you say, like, what is the greenest industry? This is a pretty green industry. It's literally like restoring ecosystems. So create incentives for restoration, create disincentives for degradation. There are enormous numbers of situations today all over, certainly in the United States, certainly all over the world, where the incentives to degrade land are huge. You get to degrade, you get to do whatever you want to, and that causes huge problems downstream or for other people. Those are the kind of externalities you get to create for them. And there's nothing preventing you from doing that. So we could work on this. Big thing to ask. We could also find ways of integrating restoration into like other required activities. My personal campaign recently has been on floodplain buyouts. We've done a lot of work studying buyouts of households that are in these high hazard areas that get flooded. And governments come in and say, hey, we'd like to get you out of harm's way. We're going to buy your houses from you. And what they do is they take the house and they tear it down and they tear out all the impervious surface, and then they throw down some grass seed and they walk away. In many, many, many cases. And it's like you're so close to actually doing real ecological restoration. I would say it's kind of like building a house, every detail of the house, then not putting on a front door. And it's like, it's legally not actually a house. Why wouldn't you go that little extra foot out of the mile and do the restoration? A lot of what we've seen in other green industries is the need for like strong local public champions. Green roofs, City Hall, that kind of thing. Having ecological restoration projects front and center. UNC actually has a stream restoration project. Daylighting a stream is done on campus. And all kinds of interesting interaction is possible because of that. And so doing more of this, I think, could be really important. If restoration is going to be used as offsets, and this is where this gets really kind of morally, ethically complicated, then make sure that that restoration is really, really high quality. So require more restoration, require better restoration. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. So increasing supply, how do we make it easy for any of you that wants to do restoration? How could you start to do this? Well, unfortunately, a lot of the incentives right now make restoration very, very difficult. There's a report that came out last year that in this industry, I've been talking about mitigation industry, average site to get it permitted takes like 2 years. There are sites that take 15 years to get permitted. I have a colleague who tells this story where there's a dam removal project in North Carolina. Dam removal is a big kind of niche within ecological restoration. And he says, my wife was pregnant when I drove to the project for the first time with her, and my daughter drove me to the project when I finished it. So, an unbelievable amount of time to actually do these projects. So how do we keep that from happening? Investing in a high quality labor force, right? Do people know how to do restoration? Do people know restoration even exists? So creating education programs, like making this, normalizing this, and then ultimately focusing on creating adequate supply chains. Now you may be saying, like, why would I want to do this? Well, literally 3 weeks ago, the European Union's restoration law just took effect. And so literally every country in the EU has to create a restoration plan. And it's like, in some places, it's going to be like 30 or 40% of the land mass of some of these countries is going to need to be restored in one way or another. So there's going to be a lot of like demand for restoration. And this actually, in theory, has teeth, right? Unlike a lot of the other commitments for restoration. So we'll see if that happens, but like, this is the kind of thing where you'd need to prepare, and there'd be a lot of labor that would be needed. So hey, kind of a cool thing to be able to do. All of the indirect effects I've been talking about, and induced effects. Imagine name a country, Cameroon. Do you have a restoration industry? No. Well, that means you have to hire people from outside of the country to come in. So those people come in, when you pay them, that money leaves. So the restoration company comes in, now they got to buy stuff. Do you have nurseries? Do you have quarries? Do you have all of the supply chain, the heavy equipment for doing restoration? No, well, you got to bring that in too. And then all of that money leaves. This has been one of the huge quandaries of international development, right? Is, hey, build these big infrastructure projects, but you're basically bringing in all of that labor from elsewhere, and then all of that money leaves. It doesn't stay in the local economy. So, hey, learned a lot from this. We could build local supply chains. One of the big things we are working on in the next couple of months is thinking about building actual codes. This makes my job like way easier, or maybe even puts me out of a job doing this, which would be awesome. Because right now you want to redo this kind of study, you've got to do this big survey. You got to talk to a lot of people instead of just going to quarterly census of employment wages and just pressing a button and all of this information comes up. So what we have suggested is having groups like the National Research Council or Society for Ecological Restoration convene a panel to basically design a hierarchy of NAICS codes that would be around maybe ecosystems, who's doing prairie restoration, who's doing forest restoration, or legal drivers, something else like that. And something that's broad and inclusive. This actually, believe it or not, has never been done before. Asking restoration experts, hey, what's like a typology of restoration? It doesn't actually exist. And then the last thing is actually thinking about restoration as an economic development tool. So, any discussion of industries and employment, basically, you start to invoke these ideas of competition, kind of competitive advantage. So, are certain geographic areas better at restoration, or fostering companies better? A classic example of this is, tech hubs and so on. But Asheville, North Carolina is like the brewing town of at least the eastern United States, right? There's this huge cluster of breweries that have started. And why did that happen? Why does industry clustering occur? Well, we're actually starting to see states like California, North Carolina, to some extent Texas, that are kind of becoming that industry clustering location. So I think if we really started to think about ways that regions could gain competitive advantage, it's the same type of thing that created, where I live, the research triangle, right? 63, 64 years ago, we had a couple of governors and a lot of other leaders that were like, we don't want North Carolina to be like South Carolina. We want there to be this huge investment in research, and that's why it's called the research triangle. You got these great universities, let's build on that. And so you got Xerox and IBM and now Google and Apple. So how could we do that with restoration? Something to consider as we move forward. Whew. I think I got through everything. I don't know if I went long or not, but thank you so much. Lots of resources.
Thank you, Todd. Yeah, I was going to make a Ohio restoration economy. There is restoration here. Alumni of our very program. For those of you who remember, Abiyanaki she did an undergrad in landscape architecture, a master's in planning, right, and now works for a firm that does a fair bit of cool ecological restoration here in the region. Much of it driven by ODOT, by the way, because that's how these things go. Any questions for Professor Bendor? Maybe time for 2 or 3. Sure. Yeah.
It's that moment when it's like me being between you and like dinner, or it's an awful position.
So I really appreciate the lecture. And when you think about the bullet points and the goals of the presentation, right? You demonstrate that there's a viable market for this. And it's generative. But there's a few things where you touched on either issues or the potentials of things. I think when you say that we need to work for better restoration, right? So how do those aspects, how do you bring those aspects to the surface? Because as much as it's really great to think about a tool that demonstrates, hey, there's worth and value in this effort, it's also really, really important that you end up doing things well, because your grassy thing at the end is really kind of telling, right? Because that is walk away.
So there is this very dangerous place where you can kind of have a race to the bottom or a race to the top in terms of standards. We wrote a paper, I had a master's student a couple of years ago, looked at this in an area of Texas where there were restoration firms that had basically created a new form of restoration. This is for streams. Used to be, if you destroyed a stream, you could offset it with a wetland. Didn't make a lot of sense. It actually violated federal regulations. So they said, okay, we're gonna make you have to start to restore streams. And so some of these companies poured a ton of money into doing very detailed, careful stream restoration. This one restoration firm basically went to regulators and was like, I did all of this restoration, count it. And it was really low quality. So the analogy I like to use here is these are regulators forcing you to buy a car. You don't want to buy a car. And they're basically saying, well, the only cars on the lot to buy are Mercedes, BMW, Lexus. And then along with comes somebody with a ton of Yugos or like really, really bad cars. And they say, you know what, those are fine too. And all of a sudden, it just destroyed demand for like the high quality restoration projects. And basically this guy was able to flood the market with this incredibly low quality restoration. So that's what I mean by like actually having regulatory standards. I mean, it'd be like a county basically being like, yeah, this whole development doesn't need to follow these parts of the building code, and all of a sudden their houses are, 20% cheaper or something like that. So you see that kind of thing where it's like standards aren't uniformly applied. The other thing that's interesting about this, I'll say, is that there is this weird kind of economic force where there are firms that become very good at specific types of restoration. And what they will lobby for is higher requirements. Because what that means is that nobody else can fulfill the requirements. Everyone now has to buy McLarens and Ferraris, right? And so you've got to buy this super high performance, this super ultimately difficult thing. There's not many other competitors that could enter the market. So they create these market entry barriers. That's an example of like a race to the tip top, right? And so that's what's interesting, is how do you leverage that, but at the same time not go the opposite direction. So it's this very it's the role of the regulator in that case. And you see this different everywhere in the country. Yeah. I hope that answered. Yeah, say that again. Which markets would? Yes, I mean, native plant nurseries are a classic example of this, right? So there are, if you were to say, this is happening in North Carolina. We want to invest, $20 million a year in a certain type of restoration. So that's going to take like an enormous amount of, say, certain types of sedges or something like that. Okay, where do those come from? Is this sustained? So it's one of the last things I kind of was starting to get at. Was this kind of sustained investment programs. So is that enough like ongoing funds that people would actually create new nurseries? So you could start to see that kind of supply chain spillover effect where that investment would like help a lot of other industries. But the flip side of that is actually what you saw during fracking in North Dakota. There's this town I remember reading about that had the highest rents in the country for a little while. It was like a 1-bedroom apartment. It was like 10 grand a month. And it was like in the middle of nowhere. And it's like, well, why is that? Well, no one's building new apartments because they know that like in a year, there's nobody to rent to. So will people build new nurseries in response to that? That's ultimately the question, right? Like, will supply respond? And maybe only if there's continued supply. Yeah, so one of the things we've been talking about is have a huge one here. So agricultural cooperative extension programs. It's so interesting. Like I grew up on a farm, and it's one of these things like in our generations, it's like farmers know what they're doing, right? Like that's an enormous assumption and really wasn't true in the 30s, right? The Dust Bowl, right? Like, terrible mistakes in agriculture. Globally, there are many, many places where there have been no kind of agricultural extension. So now it's like you've got farmers that have huge access to huge amounts of resources and information, but ultimately don't necessarily have incentives to do certain things, right? Like, there's been tons of work on how much fertilizer should I use? Well, fertilizer is still really, really cheap, and you don't actually get penalized for using too much. Why wouldn't you use huge amounts of fertilizer? And that's in the richest country in the world. We still have that problem. So what we'd actually talked about is like, what if cooperative extension services weren't necessarily just focused on agricultural productivity, but actually, and I mean, ultimately even the sustainability practices and extensions are kind of focused on productivity over the longer term. What if you were focused on, you know, things like restoration, things like, you know, shifting certain practices. So just the pure amount of landowners that aren't farmers that could use that kind of information. So that would be one where you've even got like the institutional setup for it. You know, you've already got the extension offices. They already have Rolodexes of, you know, people that they work with. Like, why not extend that to non-farmers?
Yeah, as somebody with a joint point, or
stepping on toes.
Association does this. I've written about this a little bit in my book, and in the context of our marketing, this is work that the skills that you're developing as a planning student will help you do. Because a lot of it is about one-on-one communication with farmers, convincing them and talking to them, without pretending that you yourself are a sheep farmer, but to give them the information and expertise that does exist on specific practices, including programs like CRP. But it's hard work and it's very interactive. And maybe the last question before I start talking about my own research. Sorry.
Nice.
So I was kind of curious to go back to the statistic that you gave about the ecological restoration and employment modifier. You said that there's a range of right around 1.5 to 3.8 jobs. And to me, I guess I find that curious because that's a pretty decent sized range. And if we were to say run a regression analysis, what variables do you really think would be the strongest correlates for the 3.8, right? Like if Columbus said, hey, I really want to maximize the benefits of creating this industry here at home, how do we, what would be necessary to maximize those benefits in terms of the instead of jobs?
So that range is across studies. So I don't know if you could lump all that together and actually like do that kind of meta-analysis across it, because it's just looking at different places and different times. It's a really good question. I mean, I think this is ultimately like, it depends on, I think you need a lot more data, a lot more studies. And this is one of the issues, is that there just haven't been that many studies. When we did that analysis, this was 2014. At the time, there's kind of maybe three big areas that were looking into this. One was the University of Oregon, which had done a lot of studies, but within Oregon. Another was actually the Department of the Interior. One of the great things about being a federal government agency is that when you contract, you can be like, hey, if you want your money, take this survey. And that survey is like, it's like 300 questions. I mean, the survey probably takes like 2 days to fill out for somebody who really knows what they're doing. And so they were able to get very, very detailed information on, like, to create that kind of multiplier. But the problem is that it's like only on specific types of projects and in specific locations. So like, this is why we kind of set out to do this, because nobody had really done this nationally. Like getting that big round number at the end, which we tried to do in a really rigorous way. And ultimately that rigor, I think, made it much smaller than it probably actually is. So like to be very honest, like input-output modeling, and there's a lot of hand waving and a lot of like fuzzy math. But we tried to make it so the fuzziness is like makes it smaller, so we're not blowing this out of proportion. But one of the things we never looked at, we never talked to Walmart, we never talked to Lowe's, and those companies, like we never talked to Disney. Disney owns the largest mitigation bank, like wetland restoration project, as far as I know, in the country, maybe the world. And you say, what? Celebration, Florida, like is wetland. And so every time they build a ride, and so they literally are their own like supplier and demander. But we never talked to those kinds of like those entities that are large enough that they can do stuff in-house and they don't go to the conferences and they're not part of this, this crowd. So that's why I say this is kind of like, it's very incomplete and it's very conservative. So.
The other big one I would talk to, it's been a while since I heard papers, he was military.
Yeah.
I mean, he was military bases, do extensive environmental restoration, but it's all in-house. We had an alarmable program as a military-based plan. I mean,
And getting information is just, I mean, at one point we wanted to do a survey of Army Corps of Engineers regulatory personnel, because this also does not include the entire regulatory program that enables this, which is like another $300 or $400 million a year in spending. The guy I was talking to who knew a lot about how they worked, it was like, the researchers in the audience is kind of like, well, in order to ask these types of questions, you need to talk to their bosses. But in order to get their boss's permission, you'd need to talk to their bosses. Who's your senator? You might want to start with your senator. And I was like, I'm literally going to have to get an act of Congress to talk to these people. So eventually, like, you just can't get that information. Yeah. But that would be great. Thank you.